Imagine a land where people are rounded up into camps, tortured, starved, and executed. Not under a brutal dictatorship, but under the flag of a country that calls itself a beacon of democracy. This is not Nazi Germany or Soviet gulags. This is British-ruled Kenya in the 1950s, during the Mau Mau Uprising. Welcome to Sands of History, where we peel back the layers of time to uncover the stories that shook empires and shaped nations. Today, we journey into one of the darkest and least discussed chapters of British colonial rule, the Mau Mau Rebellion, a bloody struggle for freedom that left tens of thousands dead and revealed the brutal cost of empire. Roots of the rebellion. The seeds of the Mau Mau Uprising were planted decades before the first shot was fired. When the British established colonial rule over Kenya in the early 1900s, they seized the best farmlands, particularly in the fertile Central Highlands, and handed them over to European settlers. Thousands of Kikuyu, the largest ethnic group in Kenya, were displaced from their ancestral lands, forced into wage labor on settler farms, and subjected to oppressive colonial laws. Elkins, 2005. By the 1940s, frustration was boiling over. Kikuyu peasants faced land hunger, unemployment, and racist policies that denied them political representation. Though African political movements like the Kenya African Union, KAU, tried to negotiate for reforms, British colonial authorities refused to budge. Anderson, 2005. For many, armed resistance seemed the only path forward. The rise of Mau Mau. In the late 1940s, underground militant groups began to form, primarily among the Kikuyu. They called themselves the Mau Mau, though the exact origin of the name remains debated. By 1952, Mau Mau fighters were attacking settler farms, sabotaging infrastructure, and assassinating loyalist chiefs who collaborated with the British. Anderson, 2005. The British responded with overwhelming force. On October 20th, 1952, the colonial government declared a state of emergency, banning the KAU and arresting key nationalist leaders, including a young Jomo Kenyatta, who would later become Kenya's first president. British authorities labeled Mau Mau as savages, terrorists, and a barbaric threat to civilization. Elkins, 2005. But the reality was more complex. Mau Mau fighters were mainly poor peasants fighting to reclaim their land and dignity, driven by decades of oppression. Many were deeply tied to Kikuyu cultural practices and oaths, which the British misinterpreted as evidence of primitive violence. Anderson, 2005. The brutal counterinsurgency. The British launched a massive counterinsurgency campaign to crush the uprising. This was no ordinary policing effort. It was a full-scale military operation. Tens of thousands of British soldiers, settler militias, and African loyalist forces combed the forests and villages where Mau Mau fighters operated. But the most infamous part of Britain's response was not the battles in the field. It was the vast system of detention camps and villagization. The British rounded up over 1.5 million Kikuyu civilians, relocating them into barbed wire enclosed villages and putting hundreds of thousands into detention camps. Elkins, 2005. Inside these camps, torture was routine. Detainees were subjected to forced labor, starvation, beatings, castration, and rape. Some were executed. Others were rehabilitated. Through systematic abuse meant to break their loyalty to the Mau Mau cause. Elkins, 2005. Bennett, 2013. The scale of the violence was staggering. By the end of the conflict, it's estimated that at least 20,000 Mau Mau fighters were killed, but independent estimates suggest the total number of Kenyan deaths, including civilians, may have been as high as 100,000. Elkins, 2005. Only around 200 European settlers were killed during the entire conflict. Anderson, 2005. International silence and cover-up. Despite the scale of the brutality, the Mau Mau uprising remained largely invisible to the international community at the time. British authorities tightly controlled media coverage, portraying the conflict as a small colonial police action against savages, not a large-scale war of independence. Bennett, 2013. Even after the war, the British government worked hard to suppress evidence of wrongdoing. Official documents detailing abuses were hidden or destroyed. It wasn't until decades later, after Kenyan survivors and British historians forced the issue into the open, that the full horror became known. Elkins, 2005. Anderson, 2005. The path to Kenyan independence. The Mau Mau were eventually defeated by sheer military force, but the uprising shook the foundations of British colonial rule. The brutality used to suppress the rebellion discredited Britain's moral authority, both at home and abroad. Moreover, even though moderate African nationalists like Jomo Kenyatta had been imprisoned, they emerged from detention as symbols of the independence struggle. By the early 1960s, the British realized they could no longer hold Kenya by force. In 1963, Kenya achieved independence, with Kenyatta becoming the country's first prime minister. Anderson, 2005. Legacy and reckoning. For decades, the British government refused to acknowledge its crimes in Kenya. But in 2011, survivors of Mau Mau torture filed a landmark lawsuit against the British government in London. In 2013, the UK agreed to a historic settlement. It paid £19.9 million in compensation to over 5,000 Kenyan victims and formally expressed regret for the abuses committed. Bennett, 2013. This was a rare moment of imperial accountability. Yet many historians argue that much more remains hidden, and that the Mau Mau uprising is just one chapter in a much larger global story of colonial violence. Elkins, 2005. Anderson, 2005. Conclusion. The Mau Mau uprising was not just a footnote in colonial history. It was a turning point. It revealed the brutal realities of British colonial rule, shattering the myth of a benign, civilizing empire. It showed how far people would go to reclaim their land, dignity, and freedom, and how ruthlessly an empire would fight to hold on. Today, Kenya stands as an independent nation, but the scars of the Mau Mau years run deep. Memory, justice, and healing are still unfolding. By remembering the Mau Mau, we confront not just Kenya's past, but the legacies of colonialism that shaped the modern world. Thank you for joining us on Sands of History, where we uncover the hidden, the buried, and the forgotten stories of our past. If you found this journey eye-opening, stay with us for more explorations into the sands that shaped nations and empires.